Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I invite you to take a deep breath, settle in, and follow me into the quiet edges of the American Southwest. Under a wide desert sky, where the wind carries sand across empty plains, lies a stretch of land that holds one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. When daylight touches the West Mesa near Albuquerque, New Mexico, it looks calm, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, a secret waited for years, hidden just below the dust and the silence. For a long time, no one saw anything unusual. Life continued as it always had. Cars passed along distant roads. Families walked their dogs. The desert, as it often does, kept its silence. Then, one ordinary afternoon in early 2009, everything changed. A woman out for a walk stumbled upon something that did not belong to the landscape, something that would unravel a dark truth buried in the dirt. What she found was the beginning of a case that would shake an entire community, raise painful questions, and leave investigators searching for a person who seemed to vanish just as easily as the footprints on the sand. This story is not about legends or rumors. It is about real people, women who lived, who had families, who made choices, who struggled, and who deserved protection. It is also the story of how their disappearances went unnoticed for far too long. In a world where some lives are seen as more visible and more valuable than others, these victims slipped through the cracks, unprotected and unheard. And in that silence, someone took advantage. The place where their story resurfaced would later be known by a grim name, the burial ground of the West Mesa bone collector. It is a name that still unsettles residents of Albuquerque, not because of what is known, but because of how much remains unanswered. Who was responsible? Why did the victims disappear? And how could so many lives be taken before anyone realized a pattern was forming? As investigators dug through the sand in the following weeks, they uncovered more and more remains. One discovery led to another, and soon the truth was undeniable. This was not an accident, not a single moment of violence, but the work of a calculated predator. And yet, despite one of the largest investigations in the state's history, the person responsible has never been brought to justice. Tonight, we return to the beginning, back to the moment when an ordinary walk exposed an extraordinary horror. This is where the mystery starts. This is where the questions begin. And this is the story of the West Mesa murders. When officers first arrived at the scene in February 2009, they expected a small investigation, perhaps a single incident, or even an old burial unrelated to any modern case. The West Mesa, after all, was known for its shifting soil, scattered brush, and long stretches of untouched land. But as investigators examined the area more closely, they began to sense that this was not a simple discovery. Something felt different. Something felt larger. Over the next several hours, detectives called in additional units, forensic teams, and search personnel. They marked off wider sections of ground, laying out flags, grids, and reference lines. From the air, the site looked like a patchwork of careful measurements. On the ground, however, the mood grew heavier with each new detail uncovered. The soil revealed signs of repeated disturbance, areas dug up and filled in again, suggesting that someone had returned to the same spot many times. Within days, the discovery that began with a single bone expanded into one of the most unsettling crime scenes in New Mexico's history. Piece by piece, the earth gave up its secrets. Investigators soon realized they were not looking at a single case. They were standing at the center of a hidden graveyard. And with that realization came an even more haunting question. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? The answer, at least in part, lay in the landscape itself. The West Mesa is vast, windswept, and sparsely populated. At night, It stretches into darkness without a single street lamp. During the early 2000s, before new housing projects were built nearby, the Mesa felt remote, almost forgotten. If someone wanted to hide something, it was a place where almost no one would look. But there was another reason investigators would later consider: the victims. Many of the missing women came from difficult circumstances, struggling with poverty, unstable housing, toxic relationships, or social neglect. Their disappearances were not always reported quickly, and when they were, their cases did not always receive urgent attention. This delay created a dangerous silence, a space in which a predator could operate without fear of being noticed. As news of the West Mesa discovery reached the public, families who had been searching for missing daughters, sisters, and friends began calling the authorities. For them, the phone calls were filled with both hope and dread. Hope that the answers they had begged for might finally surface. Dread because the truth might be more painful than the waiting. The investigation widened. Local police partnered with federal agencies. Tips poured in from across the state. Reporters crowded press conferences demanding updates. The calm desert that once held its silence was now the center of national attention. Yet even in those early days, one fact became painfully clear: uncovering the remains was only the beginning. Identifying the victims, tracing their last known steps, and finding the person responsible would be an entirely different battle, one that would take years, and one that still remains unfinished. As investigators began the painstaking process of uncovering each set of remains, another challenge emerged: the challenge of giving back each victim's name. The desert had concealed their stories for years, and the only way forward was through careful forensic work, dental comparisons, missing person files, and cooperation from families who had never stopped waiting for answers. The identification process took time. It demanded patience, science, and sensitivity. One by one, the victims were matched to missing women who had disappeared from Albuquerque in the early 2000s. For many families, the confirmation brought heartbreak, but also a painful sense of closure. After years of uncertainty, they finally knew where their loved ones were, though the truth was far from the one they had prayed for. As detectives studied the victims' lives, patterns began to surface. These women did not know each other personally, yet their stories intersected in haunting ways. Many had faced difficult circumstances, trying to survive through unstable living conditions, unhealthy relationships, or personal struggles. Some had lived on the edge of society, where support was scarce and danger could go unnoticed. This vulnerability made them easy targets, people whose disappearances did not trigger swift investigations or urgent headlines. The detectives realized something important. The killer had not chosen randomly. The victims were selected from a group that society often overlooks: women who were isolated, less protected, and less likely to be immediately searched for if they vanished. In that silence, someone had hunted. Former officers later reflected on those years with regret. Resources were limited, cases went unconnected, and communication between agencies was slower than it is today. In some instances, missing person reports were delayed or minimized, allowing crucial time and evidence to slip away. By the time patterns emerged, it was already too late. The damage had been done, and the killer had moved in darkness without being seen. For the families, grief was mixed with frustration. Many had tried for years to get attention on their missing loved ones, only to find their voices drowned out by the noise of bigger stories. Now, standing before investigators and reporters, they carried both love and anger: love for those they lost, and anger at how long it took for anyone to realize something was terribly wrong. Through their determination, the victims slowly became more than statistics. Their names were spoken. Their faces were publicized. Their memories became part of a larger call for accountability and reform. And with every identification, the central question grew louder. Who exploited this silence? Who watched these disappearances and believed no one would ever notice? The answers were still hidden, but one truth was now undeniable. The West Mesa case was no longer just about remains in the desert. It was about a system that had gaps, and a predator who understood how to slip through them. In the weeks following the discovery, the scale of the investigation expanded at remarkable speed. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the size of the burial site, requested assistance from state and federal agencies. Soon, the Albuquerque Police Department was joined by specialized units, forensic experts, and federal investigators who brought additional technology, manpower, and experience. Their mission was clear: uncover every piece of evidence the desert still held, and transform a disturbing scene into a structured path toward the truth. Search teams combed the mesa inch by inch. Cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, and mapping drones were deployed to document the terrain and locate potential burial zones. Investigators established a command base and began cross-referencing missing person files from multiple years, hoping to match timelines with what they were finding beneath the surface. The site became one of the largest coordinated crime scenes in state history. Yet, almost immediately, the detectives encountered obstacles that were not the result of a single action, but of time itself. The environment had worked against them. Weather, erosion, construction projects, and the natural shifting of the desert soil had disturbed portions of the land. What might once have been obvious clues were now fragmented or worn away, forcing investigators to rely on tiny details, scattered remains, and sparse physical traces. Meanwhile, tip lines were flooded with calls. Some offered genuine leads. Others were based on speculation, rumor, or fear. Sorting through them was a massive undertaking. Detectives built profiles, timelines, and maps of disappearance locations around the city. They searched for patterns and dates, neighborhoods, and associations. Despite their effort, no clear suspect emerged. The more they uncovered, the more overwhelming the mystery became. On top of the physical challenges, there were institutional ones. Early in the case, missing person reports from the early 2000s were not consistently linked to one another. Different officers, different departments, and different jurisdictions had handled cases separately, leaving behind fragmented information. Reconnecting those dots years later became a time-consuming and delicate process. Investigators also had to confront a painful truth. Many of the missing women had been overlooked in life, and in those early years, their disappearances did not receive the urgency they deserved. Now, the task force was determined to correct that. They began interviewing families, friends, and anyone who might have seen or heard something at the time. Every memory, no matter how small, had the potential to matter. Despite the difficulties, the investigation moved forward with determination. Forensic teams cataloged every recovered item, hoping that a single trace fibers, fragments, or DNA might open a path toward the person responsible. But as days turned into months, one realization slowly settled over the task force. Whoever had done this had disappeared from sight with chilling efficiency. The next phase of the investigation would require deeper strategy, sharper focus, and a willingness to confront unsettling possibilities. As the investigation deepened, detectives turned their focus toward individuals whose pasts, patterns, or proximity to the victims placed them under a brighter spotlight. The task force knew they needed to work methodically, identify potential suspects, eliminate those who did not fit, and examine more closely the ones who did. Very early on, one name rose to the surface, a man whose life and behavior had drawn attention long before the West Mesa discovery. The first major person of interest was Lorenzo Montoya, a local resident with a troubling history and a home located not far from where several victims were last seen. Investigators learned that his movements during the early 2000s overlapped with the years when the victims disappeared. Montoya's past encounters with law enforcement only strengthened suspicions. His proximity to key locations, combined with a lifestyle that placed him in regular contact with vulnerable women, made him a compelling focus for the task force. However, just as investigators began building a deeper profile around him, the trail abruptly collapsed. Montoya died in late 2006, years before the burial ground was discovered. With his death, any opportunity for direct questioning was gone, and without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, the case could not move forward in his direction. His name remained in files and theories, but no conclusion could be drawn. With no breakthrough, investigators shifted their attention to another man, Joseph Blee, sometimes referred to in local discussions because of his criminal record and long history in the area. Detectives noted similarities in timeline and geography, and his past contact with several neighborhoods connected to missing person reports made him another person worth examining. Yet again, the closer the task force looked, the more the evidence failed to align into a provable case. Suspicion alone was not enough. They needed verifiable proof, something solid, something that would stand in court, and they did not have it. These setbacks were emotionally draining for everyone involved. Each lead that fell apart forced investigators to start again, rebuilding hope only to watch it dissolve. The public wanted answers. Families wanted justice. Officers wanted progress. But the case, even with multiple persons of interest, remained painfully short on what mattered most, evidence that clearly pointed in one direction. Behind closed doors, some investigators expressed a chilling possibility that the real perpetrator might still be alive, watching quietly, relieved each time the case veered toward another dead end. Others feared a different scenario, that the person responsible might already be gone, leaving behind questions with no chance of ever being answered. Either way, one fact became impossible to ignore. Without new technology, new witnesses, or new breakthroughs, the investigation had reached its first major wall. And while the world moved on, the West Mesa case remained frozen in uncertainty, waiting for the next clue that might finally break the silence. As weeks turned into months, the West Mesa case evolved from a local tragedy into a story that drew national attention. The scale of the investigation had no precedent in Albuquerque. Dozens of detectives worked full-time, supported by forensic teams, federal partners, and specialists from multiple states. Conference rooms filled with maps, timelines, photographs, and witness statements. Entire walls became grids of information as investigators tried to connect faces, dates, and locations into a pattern they could finally understand. But the task was never limited to evidence and files. Beyond the command posts, a community was grieving. Neighborhoods that once felt distant from one another became connected through shared fear and shared sorrow. Families of missing women gathered at vigils, holding candles, photographs, and signs with names that the world had been too slow to remember. These gatherings became more than memorials. They were a united demand for answers. Soon, local reporters were at every briefing, asking questions that officials could not yet answer. News outlets across the country picked up the story, amplifying the mystery and the urgency. While this helped raise awareness, it also increased the pressure on investigators, who now had to balance transparency with the need to protect sensitive information. Every statement made to the public was weighed carefully. Every silence risked frustration or distrust. Tip lines became a lifeline for the investigation. Some callers offered thoughtful information or personal memories. Others reached out because they sensed patterns in their own neighborhoods. Even when many leads went nowhere, detectives refused to ignore a single message. They knew that one overlooked detail, one tiny clue, might be the thread that could finally pull the case open. At City Hall, community organizers and advocacy groups pushed for reforms. They questioned why so many women had vanished without immediate escalation. They asked whether deeper systemic issues, poverty, inequality, lack of resources, and slow responses to missing person cases had allowed the tragedy to grow in silence. Their voices were not confrontational, but insistent. They wanted a future where no disappearance would be dismissed or delayed. The growing public attention helped in one crucial way. It ensured that the West Mesa victims would not be forgotten again. The case could no longer fade into dusty archives or cold case shelves. The pressure from the community, the media, and the families created momentum that even time could not fully erode. Still, behind the scenes, detectives understood the painful truth. The investigation was massive, but the answers remained out of reach. The suspect, whether living or gone, was still nameless. The motive was unclear, and the path from evidence to justice was long, fragile, and uncertain. But the community refused to give up. In their voices, the task force found a reason to continue. And in their determination, the victims found something they had been denied for years: visibility. The West Mesa was no longer silent, and the city would never look at its desert the same way again. As investigators stepped back and reviewed everything they had uncovered, one realization became impossible to ignore. Whoever was responsible for the West Mesa burials had operated with patience, calculation, and a chilling understanding of human vulnerability. The offender did not act recklessly. There was planning in the timeline, coordination in the pattern, and a clear strategy behind each disappearance. Profilers from federal agencies were brought in to study the case from a psychological perspective. They searched for a behavioral signature, something that could explain not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. One of the earliest conclusions was that the offender likely selected victims for a specific reason. The women targeted were living on the margins of society, where personal struggles left them exposed and often without quick support systems. The predator knew this. He chose individuals whose absences would not immediately trigger urgent investigations, giving him time, distance, and control. Investigators also noted the spacing of disappearances. This was not chaotic. The offender seemed to observe, select, and wait. The timeline suggested someone who lived locally, watched closely, and understood the rhythms of the community. He was not in a rush, and that was perhaps the most unsettling trait of all. Patience meant confidence. Patience meant experience, and patience allowed him to remain unnoticed. The burial method itself spoke volumes. It hinted at someone familiar with isolated land and unmonitored spaces. Someone who understood that the mesa, with its wide terrain and lack of development at the time, could hide secrets for years. There was no attempt to display the crime, no messaging, no desire for attention. This pointed toward a person who was not interested in recognition. Instead, he preferred silence and invisibility. Profilers debated his daily life. Was he a loner, operating in secrecy with no one aware of his actions? Or was he someone who blended into society, maintaining a job, neighbors, or even relationships, someone who looked ordinary, spoke politely, and never raised suspicion? Both possibilities were plausible. But one phrase appeared again and again in internal discussions, hidden in plain sight. Another key question weighed heavily on investigators. Did the offender stop, or was he stopped by circumstance? Some believed he may have relocated, changing states, or even changing his life entirely. Others feared he might still be near Albuquerque, simply waiting or watching. A third theory suggested that he might no longer be alive, which would explain the sudden end to the pattern in the mid-2000s. Regardless of which theory was closest to the truth, the psychological portrait remained consistent. This was someone who understood risk, avoided attention, and learned from his surroundings. He exploited silence, opportunity, and isolation. And because he selected victims whose disappearances did not spark immediate alarms, he stayed invisible long enough to leave a graveyard behind. For investigators, that profile was both a direction and a warning. They were dealing with someone who had studied the cracks in the system and slipped through them step by step without ever being seen. As months passed and the investigation stretched into years, the momentum that once fueled the task force began to slow. What started as a massive operation with daily updates, press briefings, and fresh leads gradually shifted into a quiet, grinding search for answers that no longer came. It was not that investigators stopped caring. It was that the trail itself had stopped speaking. Every strong lead eventually unraveled. Potential suspects were eliminated. Witness accounts grew stale. Memories faded, and the scattered pieces of information never formed a complete picture. Detectives who had once believed a breakthrough was near now found themselves facing the harsh reality of cold case work. Sometimes, even the most determined investigation meets a wall that refuses to move. The desert, in its silence, had held the truth for years. Now, even after giving up its secrets, it seemed unwilling to offer anything more. With no new physical evidence, no fresh sightings, and no proven suspect, the case entered the most difficult phase of all the standstill. The kind where time becomes the greatest enemy. Inside the department, rotations and reassignments slowly changed the faces attached to the case. Some investigators retired. Others moved to new units with new responsibilities. The boxes of files remained stacked and organized, but the energy around them dimmed. The story that once dominated headlines faded from national news, replaced by newer events. The investigation was still open, but hope was no longer steady. It flickered. For the families, this was the most painful period. They had endured loss, then endured publicity, but now they had to endure silence. They continued to attend vigils. They continued to call for updates. But the answers they sought seemed to drift farther away with each passing season. Grief became routine. Waiting became a way of life. Detectives often describe cold cases as battles against time, and this one was no different. Evidence degrades. Witnesses relocate. Records get misplaced. And technology, while improving, cannot always fix what was not collected in the first place. The West Mesa investigation became a symbol not of failure, but of how fragile truth can be when opportunity is lost in the early moments. Still, the case was never forgotten. Even in the quietest years, there were investigators who kept a piece of the West Mesa with them on their desks, in their notebooks, or in a drawer they opened more often than they admitted. They revisited old interviews, their timelines. They watched for patterns that might one day reveal themselves. But no matter how many times they returned to the files, the ending remained the same. The story had paused, and no one knew when it would move again. Years after the investigation went quiet, a quiet shift began to take place in laboratories and task force rooms across the country. Science was changing. Technology was evolving. And with those changes came something that the West Mesa case desperately needed: a new way to search for old truths. This renewed hope did not arrive with flashing headlines or dramatic announcements. It came slowly through upgraded databases, improved DNA techniques, and legislation that gave investigators more tools than they had in 2009. One of the most significant developments was the rise of advanced genetic testing and expanded DNA comparison systems. Techniques that once required large, pristine samples could now extract information from smaller and more fragile material. Even trace evidence, once considered unusable, could be analyzed with a level of precision that did not exist when the remains were first uncovered. Investigators began revisiting old evidence with new eyes, asking the same question over and over: is there something here we missed? Meanwhile, forensic genealogy, once an experimental concept, became a powerful new weapon in solving cold cases. Across the United States, long unsolved crimes were being reopened and resolved through matches with distant relatives in public DNA databases. Each breakthrough in another case sent a ripple of hope through Albuquerque, strengthening the belief that one day science might finally speak for the women of the West Mesa. These developments pushed local leaders and lawmakers to action. In recent years, Albuquerque police have voiced strong support for new policies allowing investigators broader access to DNA data, including samples from deceased individuals who were never ruled out as suspects. The goal was simple: eliminate or confirm leads that had stalled the investigation for nearly 2 decades. If even one piece of genetic evidence could connect to a name, the entire case could shift overnight. The renewed attention also revived community involvement. Reporters returned to the story. Documentaries, cold case programs, and investigative journalists reintroduced the victims to a national audience, reminding viewers that the case was still open, still painful, and still in need of answers. Tip lines, once quiet, began receiving calls again, some small, some uncertain, but all worth listening to. Investigators approached this new phase with a blend of realism and determination. They understood that breakthroughs were not guaranteed, and that time had already taken its toll. But they also knew something just as important. For the first time in many years, the case no longer felt frozen. Technology had unlocked doors that were once sealed shut. Silence was no longer the final word. With renewed tools, renewed public interest, and renewed purpose, the West Mesa case entered a new chapter, one defined not by despair, but by possibility. The desert, once a place of unanswered questions, now faced a future where science might finally uncover the name the city had been waiting for. While investigators pushed forward with technology and renewed strategies, another group carried the weight of the case in a far more personal way: the families. For them, the West Mesa tragedy was not an abstract mystery or a headline that faded with time. It was a daily ache and empty chair at a kitchen table, a birthday that no longer felt like a celebration, a voicemail they replayed just to hear a familiar voice again. Long after cameras left and reporters moved on, these families continued to live inside the aftermath. Many of them became advocates, determined to make sure their loved ones would never be forgotten. They spoke at community meetings, attended memorial walks, and supported one another through anniversaries that reopened wounds. Some created outreach programs for vulnerable women in Albuquerque, hoping to protect others from disappearing into silence. Their mission was rooted not only in grief, but in purpose. If the system had failed their daughters, their voices would not. Over time, the city itself began to reflect this commitment. Memorials were built. Vigils became annual events. Along the West Mesa, a somber space was dedicated so that the victims' names could stand in the open, no longer hidden beneath unmarked soil. The desert that once symbolized secrecy slowly transformed into a place of remembrance. Visitors came to lay flowers, leave notes, whisper prayers, or simply stand in quiet reflection. These gatherings served another role as well. They kept the case alive in the public conscience. Each vigil was both a tribute and a reminder, a message to the authorities that the community still expected answers, and a message to the world that every one of the victims mattered. They were not forgotten, and they would not be reduced to a footnote in a cold case file. For the families, the memorials offered moments of connection, but they did not erase the pain. Some described their grief as a landscape they learned to walk through, never escaping it, only adjusting to its shape. What gave them strength was the hope that one day there would be accountability, and the truth would finally replace the unanswered questions that shadowed their lives. Even as years passed, their presence at public events, press conferences, and city council meetings sent a powerful message: justice does not expire. The determination of these families became one of the driving forces that ensured the case stayed open, funded, and active. Their persistence helped inspire lawmakers, researchers, journalists, and even strangers across the country who followed the story and demanded progress. Through remembrance, they built resilience. Through resilience, they built pressure. And through pressure, they helped keep the path toward justice from fading completely. The West Mesa victims were no longer nameless, no longer silent, and no longer hidden beneath the desert wind. Today, more than a decade after the discovery on the West Mesa, the case remains open, active, and deeply personal for the city of Albuquerque. Although the investigation has shifted into its cold case phase, it has not been forgotten or abandoned. A dedicated team continues to monitor tips, re-examine evidence, and revisit old leads with modern tools that were unavailable in 2009. The reward, up to $100,000 for information leading to an arrest or conviction, still stands, serving as a public reminder that the search is not over and that justice, even delayed, is still expected. In recent years, a new wave of optimism has emerged from changes in state policy and forensic advancement. Lawmakers, prompted in part by the West Mesa tragedy, have pushed for expanded DNA legislation laws that would allow investigators to use a wider range of genetic databases, including those involving deceased individuals who were never cleared as suspects. Supporters argue that this approach could unlock critical information, allowing investigators to eliminate old names or confirm long-standing suspicions without waiting for a living suspect to re-offend or resurface. At the same time, forensic teams have begun to apply updated techniques to previously recovered evidence. Even small particles once considered insufficient can now be examined through advanced methods such as familial DNA searching and forensic genealogy. These tools have already solved high-profile cold cases across the United States, and investigators believe they could eventually do the same for the West Mesa victims, transforming fragments of evidence into the missing link that the case has long needed. Public awareness has also grown stronger. Documentaries, investigative articles, podcasts, and anniversary coverage have reintroduced the case to a national audience. Each retelling brings renewed public pressure, encouraging witnesses, old or new, to come forward. Detectives continue to emphasize a critical point. Even after so many years, one voice, one memory, or one overlooked detail could break the silence. Time may complicate evidence, but it does not erase truth. Despite the renewed energy, however, the case remains delicate and unpredictable. Investigators are careful not to raise false hope. There are still major uncertainties: whether the suspect is alive or dead, whether crucial evidence remains intact, and whether the final breakthrough will come from science, testimony, or a combination of both. What has changed, though, is the mindset. The case no longer feels resigned to darkness. Instead, it stands at a threshold where progress, while slow, is finally possible. The West Mesa story has entered its newest chapter, one defined not by loss, but by persistence. The city remembers, the families endure, and the investigation, strengthened by new tools and a louder public voice, continues forward with a single, unwavering goal: to speak the final truth that has been buried for far too long. The West Mesa case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in modern American history, not simply because it is unsolved, but because of what it reveals about silence, vulnerability, and the hidden spaces in our society. Long after the search teams packed up their equipment and the headlines faded from the front pages, the story continues to echo through Albuquerque. It lives in memorials, in annual vigils, in the memories of grieving families, and in the determination of investigators who refuse to give up. For many, the case is a reminder of a painful truth, that some lives are allowed to disappear more quietly than others. The women who vanished were daughters, sisters, friends, human beings with dreams, fears, laughter, and names that deserve to be spoken. Their stories serve as a call for empathy, awareness, and accountability. They remind us that every missing person report matters, and that no life should ever be overlooked because of circumstance or struggle. The desert, once a place of secrecy, now stands as both a warning and a promise. A warning that darkness can grow when no one is paying attention. A promise that truth can still rise, even after years of silence. And while the answers may not yet be known, the pursuit of those answers has reshaped policies, inspired advances in forensic science, and awakened a collective demand for justice that will not fade. Today, the case sits at a crossroads, unfinished, but not forgotten. The investigation continues. The technology improves. The community persists, and the memory of the victims has become stronger than the mystery that surrounds them. One day, someone will speak. One day, a detail will surface. One day, the final piece will fall into place. And when that moment comes, the story will no longer be about what was taken, but about what was reclaimed, truth, dignity, and a long-awaited measure of peace. Until then, the West Mesa stands as sacred ground guarding the past, challenging the present, and waiting for the future to deliver the name that history still owes. The West Mesa murders remain an unfinished chapter, a story suspended between silence and truth. It is a reminder that justice can move slowly, that systems can fail, and that vulnerable lives can disappear without the world noticing soon enough. But it is also a reminder of something else, that memory is powerful, and that a community that refuses to forget can keep a case alive long after the trail has gone cold. Tonight, we have walked together across the desert through the discovery, the investigation, the suspects, the setbacks, the families, and the fragile hope that science now carries. The answers have not yet arrived, but the questions still matter. And as long as they matter, the story is not over. Thank you for spending your time with me, for listening, and for remembering the names behind this case. If you believe every story deserves a voice, especially the stories of those who cannot speak for themselves, I invite you to stay with this channel, where we continue to revisit the mysteries the world refuses to let go of. Until we meet again in the next episode, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and good night.